Okay, I promise. The election will be over Tuesday, unless, of course, there's a recount. Boo. You thought Halloween was scary? Good morning and welcome to Sunday Insight. I'm Charlie Sykes. Welcome to our special pre-election edition of Sunday Insight. In the week that was, former top executives at Trek say that Mary Burke was actually fired. Burke pushes back, saying she was simply reorganized out of a job. The Giants win the World Series again. The Packers lose a forgettable game in New Orleans. The president comes to town to campaign. And after tens of millions of dollars in political ads, voters finally get ready to vote if they haven't done it already. But we start with the final flurry in the race for governor. The final Marquette University law poll shows Governor Scott Walker opening a 7-point lead on Mary Burke, 50% to 43%. That's among likely voters. Among registered voters, Walker leads by just 1 point. And then there was this, a report by the independent Wisconsin Reporter that raised serious last-minute questions about Burke's resume. Two former executives, the former human resources director and the former chief operating officer of the company, Tom Albers, say that Burke had been fired by her own family company for mismanagement. Republicans quickly jumped on the story.
Fireworks in the race for governor. She was fired from her family's company.
Burke was fired from Trek Bicycle.
We reorganized and eliminated a position that I had.
There were significant personnel issues under her leadership.
Her family-owned company decided, quote, "This isn't working. We have to make a change."
We were losing money.
She wasn't performing and was difficult to work with.
Burke questioned the timing of the story and said the former executives were lying about her.
Do you think Tom Albers is not telling the truth? Is he lying?
Yeah, these are complete lies, fabrications, and, Tom had an axe to grind.
Joining me on our panel this morning, defense attorney Dan Adams, the former Speaker of the State Assembly, Scott Jensen, who makes his triumphant return after 12 years, political strategist Linda Bruin, and the managing editor of RightWisconsin.com, Colin Roth. Okay, how does that story play, that last-minute Mary Burke may have been fired story, play this close to the election, Scott Jensen?
I don't think it's actually going to change any voters' minds. This is an election of people who are either for Scott Walker or people who are against Scott Walker. Mary Burke is sort of a bit player in this election. So any questions about her competency or experience are unlikely to change any of the votes. It does slow any momentum she might have had down and make it difficult for her to pick up ground in the final day.
Okay, so how credible are these allegations?
Not at all. This is
This
is your classic October surprise. Usually that's the calling card of a campaign that is desperate or losing.
Yeah.
So I don't put any weight on this at all.
Okay, well, first of all, you have the former chief operating officer of the company who comes forward and says that I was there, I did it, I saw it. How can it have no weight whatsoever?
The primary source for this scandal is a guy named Gary Ellerman, who is a partisan hack. He is so far to the right, he makes Scott Jensen look like Che Guevara.
Okay, well, interesting enough, Mary Burke has a commercial making that exact same point, but the key person is Tom Albers, who is not a partisan hack. He gave $50. The big question that I have is, why are we only learning this 6 days before the election, if in fact it might be true?
Downsized, eliminated, reduced, fired. We don't really know, do we? But we do know something happened in the early 90s, and there's some dispute about it. And I think what this really gets to is that Mary Burke's resume, Mary Burke's vetting was never actually done by a lot of reporters in this state.
Okay. I think the reason why it's done just a few days before the election is the most simple reason possible. It is timed for the election. Albers was around 6 months ago, around a year ago, when she announced. He could have said this to a reporter at any time. And they chose to do the story now. And what you said about an October surprise, this is a classic last-minute mudslinging dump. And like Scott, I actually don't think it will change much, because the folks that support her.
Your analysis is bogus for two reasons. Number one, if the Walker campaign was involved, they would have dumped this months earlier. They would not have waited this long in the campaign. They also would not have dumped it through an online website like, Wisconsin Reporter as opposed to mainstream. The reality is, and you're right, Tom Albers has been around for a long time, and he said at one point that he had decided that he would tell the truth to anybody that asked, but nobody asked. And I think what this underlines is two things: how many gaps there are in her resume, what a terrible job the mainstream media did in vetting her. When you think about all of the resources devoted to this campaign, all of the stories that we have written about Scott Walker's bald spot, about his years at Marquette, and yet no one really went in and looked at the obvious gaps in her resume. And this is not the only gap. I mean, you have a woman who claimed that she was massively successful. She ends up, leaving her family company. She goes on a 2-year-long snowboarding sabbatical. This did not raise all kinds of red flags on the part of the mainstream media. Why weren't they not reporting on this story months ago?
Maybe they did, and they decided it was bogus. I mean, again, the person who's leading the charge here is a guy who is the Jefferson County GOP.
You don't want to talk about Tom Albers, don't you? You don't want to talk about Tom Albers.
I mean, the way the response that's coming back from the Burke camp is that these were disgruntled former employees, and that's part of the. You got to factor that in as well. It is possible that you're not a Republican hack, that Albers isn't a hack, but does dislike the company and dislike her.
The media is just asking questions this week. Now they found some other executive who actually backs up Mary Burke's side of the story, but they just found that out yesterday. I mean, why weren't they asking people who have worked at the company for the last 6 months how well she did there? That's a common thing for the media to do. When you run from the private sector, they investigate what your career was in the private sector.
This is an important story because it really goes to the heart of her candidacy, doesn't it, Colin Roth?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what we found out through this campaign is that she's part of Trek. She is the Department of Commerce, and these are central features. In one of her campaign ads, there's a big line showing her success at Trek supposedly, and now we're getting these types of reports that, as we say, we don't know the type of credibility.
Very interesting, by the way, that the Trek cannot release any of the records about any of the financial things that she did with them, but they were able to put their hands on those personnel records immediately, weren't they? This is an important story. I agree it's not going to make any difference because I don't think anyone was voting for Mary Burke in this campaign. This is a referendum on Scott Walker. But what I think it suggests is that her entire persona and the rationale for her candidacy turns out to be fictitious, if not fraudulent. What has your glass half full? What has your glass half empty this week? Let's go around the table. Dan Adams, you're first.
My glass is half full because the city of Milwaukee's teenage birth rate dropped for the 7th year in a row. In 2006, our city's teen birth rate was 52 births per 1,000. Last year's rate was under 23 births per 1,000. My glass is half empty because in 2013, birth rates among teenage African American girls actually rose over 4%, the wrong direction. Hopefully 2014 will show a drop in all populations. Girls deserve to be girls, not moms.
Scott Jensen.
My glass is half full because all of the punditry and speculation about the 2014 elections is finally coming to a close. My glass is half empty because that means the speculation about the 2016 campaigns begins on Tuesday night.
Linda Bruin.
Well, my glass is half empty because last week our community lost a wonderful educator in Mark Harris, who was principal of Shorewood Intermediate School. But my glass is half full because the legacy he left for his students was a positive, believe-in-yourself mentality that will sustain and uplift his students for years to come.
Colin Roth.
My glass is half full because it looks like Republicans will take a majority in the U.S. Senate. My glass is half empty because I fear President Obama will simply go ahead with more unilateral action, perhaps provoking even a constitutional crisis.
Well, my glass is half full because we are finally getting more information about Mary Burke's resume. It's half empty because, as I mentioned before, if the media had actually been doing its job, we would have known this months ago. Now, next on Sunday Insight, voters will pick a new Attorney General on Tuesday. And as we go to break, a later moment from the campaign trail, Governor Walker's opinion of media coverage of his campaign.
You all cover things like my thumb more than you cover my opponent. You cover the bald spot in my head more than you cover my opponent.
Well, besides governor, voters on Tuesday will also pick a new top cop for the state of Wisconsin. The race for Attorney General pits Democrat Susan Happ, the district attorney of Jefferson County, against Republican Brad Schimmel, who is DA in Waukesha County. Now, no surprise here, the race has been a sometimes bitter one, complete with dueling attack ads in which the candidates question each other's records and integrity. Do you have a sense of who's got an edge in this race, Colin Roth?
I think Brad Schimmel does. He's got more endorsements from law enforcement. He's got some very, very significant. He's got some bipartisan endorsements on law enforcement that I don't think Susan Happ can say. And there's just a sense that his prosecutorial experience is something that voters want. You're not going to see it really show up in the polls, though.
Okay, Dan Adams.
What was interesting about the Marquette poll on this race was 70% of voters have no opinion, so they don't know. And I think that bodes well for Susan Happ. Remember, remember her August primary, she came out of nowhere and just blew the brakes off of the competition from Dane County and Milwaukee. Here comes this woman, blue-collar ethos, and just runs the table. I think she could do that again.
Okay, you think so?
Yeah, I disagree, because I agree with the point that Dan made that not many people know the two candidates here, but that means the one with the most money for advertising at the end is going to win. That's clearly Schimmel and his camp and supporters there. I think the second thing is really sort of what Colin mentioned. It's an unusual thing in this hyper-partisan environment we now have in Wisconsin for Democrat law enforcement officials to endorse the Republican candidate for Attorney General.
I actually think that Schimmel will, by the narrowest of margins, beat her, only because I think that the governor is going to win re-election, and that the voters that vote for the governor will vote for Schimmel. Otherwise, I think she would have won.
See, I had the opposite take on this one. I think that he will win by a larger margin than Scott Walker win for this reason. Remember back in 2006 when the Democrats were winning everything? Voters went out and they elected J.B. Van Hollen. J.B. Van Hollen was the only Republican to win anything that year. And I think it's in part because you have voters who are willing to vote for liberal politicians for everything except for judicial and law enforcement positions like Attorney General. If you are perceived to be the soft on crime candidate in a race like this, I think you're at a tremendous disadvantage. And unfortunately, Susan Happ just has a lot of baggage. I mean, you know, from the case where she had the land deal with the guy charged with sexual assault to the number of, you know, cases she's pleaded out for insanity, she's just got too many issues there. So if voters think that Brad Schimmel is tougher on crime, that he is the law enforcement candidate, he's going to have that edge, and I think he's going to win by a bigger margin than Walker. I think he's going to get more votes than Walker. Well, I'm sorry, a bigger percentage than Walker.
Well, Susan Happ also has a gender advantage, which I think we need to consider. And again, her background of being this kind of tough woman from a red county could really play in her favor.
Except she's not a tough woman from a red county. That's part of the problem. Okay, now you may not want to hear it, but we're going to tell you anyway. Let's hand out some unsolicited advice this week. Dan Adams, you're first.
Mine is for anyone interested in politics. Pay attention to the development of the new Bucks Arena. The political Royal Rumble will be fascinating as it involves all the political players. Let's hope Milwaukee can use the battle to catalyze the city in a positive way.
Scott Jensen.
My advice is for the state's media. Next time, let's do fewer investigative stories about Scott Walker's bald spot and more on Mary Burke's career. Shouldn't the media have talked to people who worked with her before the final week of the campaign?
Linda Bruin.
Well, my advice is very simple. If you care about jobs, taxes, the environment, and whether we send our troops to fight on foreign soil, vote on Tuesday. Vote and get your friends to vote too.
Colin Roth.
My advice is for Mike Tate and the Democratic Party of Wisconsin. Between Susan Happ's dirty land deals and Mary Burke's firing from her own company, you might want to vet these candidates better.
Well, my unsolicited advice is for any of you out there thinking of running for governor. Don't plagiarize your jobs plan and don't falsify your work history unless, of course, you're a Democrat, then no big deal. Next on Sunday Insight, we'll talk about other races that we'll be keeping a close eye on Tuesday night. And as we go to break, some more fun from the president's campaign visit this week.
You don't have to wait till Election Day. You can vote all week. I mean, you can only vote once. This isn't Chicago now. You can. I'm teasing Chicago. I'm messing with you. That was a long time ago.
The governor's race isn't the only big job on the ballot. Voters will decide control of the state legislature, elect 8 congressmen, and one of the more hotly contested races in our area, the 6th congressional district race, pitting Democrat Mark Harris, the Winnebago County executive, against Republican Glenn Grothman for the seat held by outgoing Representative Tom Petri, who was there forever. So let's go around the table. Tell me the races that folks should be watching Tuesday night, the ones you're most interested in, Dan Adams.
I'm fascinated by this Door County, Kewaunee County assembly race for Gary Bises' seat. It's
the Republican.
It's a Republican seat, but there is a moderate Democrat running against a moderate Republican in a pretty even area up there. The Democrat, this guy named Joe Majeski, longtime principal, grows hops for beer, seems like a neat guy who could actually pull it off.
Don't Democrats always pretend to be moderates right before the election, though? I mean, isn't that... Okay, Scott Jensen, what are you looking at?
Well, I'm interested in a race where the Democrats' war on women rhetoric is actually being turned against them. In the Oshkosh Assembly seat, Representative Gordon Hintz, who was arrested for soliciting a prostitute a couple years ago and then for screaming obscenities on the floor of the legislature at Representative Michelle Litchens.
Who usually sits where you're sitting.
Yes.
Yeah.
So is facing a big blowback from all that in the campaign up there. And I think it's possible that the voters of Oshkosh decide to end Gordon Hintz's war on women on Tuesday.
Okay, now that would be kind of a long shot, though, right?
Yeah, it's about a 55% Democratic district, but you know, I just think it's hard to sell to Democrat voters the notion that a man who treats women like that should be reelected.
So, but if Gordon Hintz goes down, that would be an indication the Republicans are having a very good night on the legislative elections.
And they will.
Okay.
Well, there's four districts that have no incumbent running, 9, 11, 19.
Assembly districts?
Assembly districts, excuse me, yeah. And I think those are very interesting because you could get some fresh blood. I'm also interested in District 25, which is the district where the iron mine is being proposed. And that race is all about the iron mine. And I think that Janet Bewley, the Democrat, actually has a heads up there. So I think that's a real good one to watch as well.
Okay, Colin Roth.
I'm looking at the Secretary of State race. It's one that's kind of largely gone under the radar, and there's almost no polling on it that I know of. But we have an African-American Republican, a young guy named Julian Bradley. He's traveled all over the state. He's been working really hard. And against a longtime incumbent, you know, Doug LaFollette with a famous name who's been there forever. Who knows? It could be interesting.
Now, people think you mispronounced that name, but I was telling you the story.
Yeah.
When Doug LaFollette first came to Wisconsin, he called himself Doug LaFollette, and he actually almost beat Les Aspin in the primary. Well, I think there's a number of races. I'm going to be very interested to see what kind of a margin Glenn Grothman comes out, because if he wins by 10, 11 points, I think he's going to be there for a while. If he wins by 2 or 3 points, then I think he's going to have a target on his back in 1996. It's also going to be extremely interesting watching what happens in some of these Senate races that Democrats thought they were going to pick up. At the beginning of the year, I think there was a lot of expectations that they might pick up the seat held by former Senator Mike Ellis, or outgoing Senator Mike Ellis. I don't think they're going to pick that seat up. And I don't think that people thought that Republicans were going to be able to hold Dale Schultz's seat when Dale Schultz left. And I think that they're likely to do that. So I think this is going to be a very, very bad night for Senate Democrats. And then the question is, what happens to Senate Democratic leader Chris Larson afterwards, if they have as bad a night as they think they're going to have? So what is it you don't get? Let's go around the table. Dan Adams, you're first.
How GDP continues to rise at a good clip and unemployment numbers continue to fall nationwide, but conservatives refuse to acknowledge the improving economy under Obama's tenure, except when the PR is used to boost Scott Walker.
Scott Jensen.
What I don't get is why the Democrats and their labor allies put all of their eggs in the Mary Burke basket, leaving Democratic legislators completely defenseless. As a result, on election night, they're going to lose everything.
Linda Bruin.
Well, what I don't get are Republicans who claim that Kentucky Democrat Allison Lundgren Grimes disqualified herself from office by refusing to say if she voted for President Obama. But these same Republicans refused to call out an Iowa Republican candidate, Joni Ernst, for refusing to speak to editorial boards.
Colin Roth.
What I don't get is that if people really think the Trek firing story was pushed by the Walker campaign, why would they wait until now when it is almost too late to make a difference?
And by the way, I wish more candidates would refuse to meet with editorial boards. What I don't get is why Mary Burke thought it was a good idea to bring President Obama to town. Now, it may help with turnout in the city of Milwaukee, but it's going to hurt in the rest of the state where less than 40% of likely voters say they approve of Obama's performance. I sense a backfire. Okay, next on Sunday Insight, our panel will make predictions of the winners and losers of next Tuesday's election. Okay, it is crunch time, a chance for our pundits to lay down their markers and make some hard predictions in the race for governor, attorney general, legislature. Who wins and by how much? Dan Adams, you're first.
I predict Republicans will hold the Assembly and State Senate. The State Senate being the disappointment, as making gains in the chamber was supposed to be the Democrats' silver lining this cycle. Susan Happ will win 53-47, and Mary Burke and Scott Walker will tie, and we'll have months of recounts, litigation, and gnashing of teeth.
Oh, my goodness. Okay, Scott Jensen.
Wisconsin will continue its trend of voting Republican in the off years and Democrat in the presidential elections. Walker's going to win with 51%, Schimmel with 52%. the Republicans will increase their margins in both houses of the legislature.
Linda Bruin.
Well, in Wisconsin, I predict that Governor Walker will beat Mary Burke on a 52-48 split, and our state will stay deeply divided. And because I believe Walker will win, Schimmel will edge out Happ for Attorney General by a narrow margin. For U.S. Congress, I predict that this will be a classic 6-year election where the incumbent president's party suffers losses in both houses of Congress. The real question is whether Republicans will gain enough seats to take control of the Senate, and unfortunately, I think the Dems will gain some and lose some, but in the end, the Senate will go Republican.
Colin Roth.
I predict Governor Walker will be elected with 53%. Brad Schimmel may even come close to 55%. I might be drinking my own Kool-Aid. Republicans will maintain control of both state assembly and the state Senate, and Republicans will win 6 seats on election night with 2 more races heading to a runoff.
That's in the U.S. Senate seat. Okay, I'm a slightly bit more conservative than you are, but you knew that. See, I'm saying that Walker wins 52-48. That's 4 points. Schimmel, I think, wins by a bigger margin, 53-47. Republicans keep the state assembly, pick up 1 seat in the state Senate, and then Republicans pick up 6 seats and take control of the U.S. Senate. Thanks for joining us. You can check the tape afterwards. Join me for my radio show Monday morning on News Radio 620 WTMJ from 8:30 until noon. Have a great week.